Here we are, the end of July here in South Georgia, Zone 8B, and it's time to harvest our winter squash. It's a pretty cool morning out here, considering it's the end of July. We're about 75 this morning. Nice overcast. It's gonna be a good morning to harvest all these winter squash. This is gonna take a while. I got a little over ambitious and grew a pretty good sized patch. It's the biggest patch of winter squash I've ever grown. But it's gonna be fun, and we'll have lots to eat for a while. So winter squash are a staple in our garden down here in the South. For us, it's just like corn, tomatoes, and beans. It's something we grow every year, something that we really count on as a food source going into the fall and winter months. So the reason when they call it winter squash is not because you grow it in the winter. You grow it start it in the spring, just like you would summer squash, usually a few weeks later than your summer squash. And it grows for 3-4 months or so. And then you harvest them, around July sometime for us, mid-July to late July. And then they store into the winter, and you can eat them throughout the winter. That's why they call them winter squash. Now there's lots of different winter squash varieties out there. We always kind of pick a different one every year. There's 3 main species of winter squash. You've got your Cucurbita pepo, which is your things like your acorn squash, your spaghetti squash, and if you've been following along with our other videos, those new Algonquian squash that we tried this year, those are all C. pepo varieties. Those are not going to store as long as some of the other winter squash species, but they tend to be a little more sweeter in flavor. So usually the sweeter the winter squash is, the less the storage time. So with those, you're probably looking at a month or 2 max storage. The other species we have are the Cucurbita Maxima, and those are things like your kabocha squash. Those are really good, pretty sweet. Those will store a little bit longer than the pepo varieties, but not quite as long as some of these guys here. So the butternut and things like your Seminole Pumpkin, your Cherokee Tan Pumpkin, these are in the C or Cucurbita Maxima family. And these are going to give you the longest storage time. I would say they're not quite as sweet as some of the others, and that's why they store longer. But these are going to store the longest for you. Also, these seem to, they have much fewer issues with vine borers. Now, we don't have a whole lot of squash vine borer pressure around here, but for those of you that do, if you have heavy vine borer pressure, you definitely want to make sure you're growing some of these C. Maxima varieties. And if you go to our website and look at all of our winter squash offerings, we have the species name listed there, so you can pick which one is going to work well for you or what you're going for. Maybe you're going for sweetness, not necessarily storage. Maybe you're going for, long-term storage with something like these butternuts here. Even for the ones like the C. pepos that don't store super long, you can always kind of scrape out the meat there, put it in a bag and freeze it and keep it that way. A good way to kind of preserve the harvest there. So this year I grew 2 varieties in this plot that we're sitting in right now. I grew these South Anna butternuts, and I grew a variety of acorn squash called Table Ace. Now, I'm not super hopeful on the acorn squash. I'll tell you why. We made a few mistakes along the way, and I'll tell you all about that later. But as far as planting multiple winter squash varieties in the same plot, you can do that as long as they're different species. So the acorn squash is C. pepo, this is C. Maxima, so no worries there. This variety of butternut we grew is one that we just added to our site this year, and it's called South Anna butternut. Now this is a stabilized hybrid. So this was a hybrid at one point, and now it's just an open pollinated variety. And it was bred by some guys in Virginia that do a lot of plant breeding, trying to impart disease-resistant characteristics to certain varieties. So what they did was they took a Waltham butternut, which is kind of the standard, most popular butternut variety out there, just your standard OP variety of butternut squash. And they crossed it with a Seminole Pumpkin. Both of those are C. machata types. Now the Seminole Pumpkin kind of originated down in the Everglades, has really strong mildew resistance, powdery mildew, downy mildew, just an extremely vigorous variety. Does really well for us here in the South. We've grown them many times before. So what they did was they crossed those two, and they just kept breeding them together and selecting for the best fruits, and over so many generations they achieved some level of stabilization there, where we have a butternut shaped fruit here, but the plants and everything have characteristics, those disease resistant properties that we see with the Seminole Pumpkin. And I will have to say, this is definitely the most vigorous variety of butternut I have ever seen, because it has those properties from the Seminole Pumpkin in it. These plants are absolutely amazing. The only thing close to this I've seen as far as winter squash vigor is our Cherokee Tan Pumpkin, which has super vigorous plants as well. These things are, pretty much resistant to everything, and they just take the heat and humidity really, really well. So we plant these things in the spring, and usually takes about 110 days to harvest. If you live in the South, you can also grow a fall crop of these. If you're growing winter squash in the fall, I would say definitely grow one of these varieties that have some disease resistant properties. So if you have, if you still have 3 or 4 months before your first frost date, you probably still have time to get a crop of these in. If you live up north, you would, need to wait till next spring to get some in the ground. So in some areas you can get 2 crops of winter squash in. Usually we just do the spring crop, and that gives us plenty of food. We don't necessarily need to grow one for the fall crop. So before we start harvesting these, I want to show you the kind of 4 main ways we know when these guys are ready to harvest. With the except, we know kind of the time of year when we should be harvesting winter squash, but I want to show you or tell you about the 4 telltale signs of when these guys are ready to gather. Because unlike summer squash, where we go in and we pick them every day or every other day, these winter squash is a one-time harvest. We wait till we see certain signs with our plants and our fruits, and we go in and we harvest them all at one time, just like we're going to do today. So the first way we can tell when our winter squash are ready is when these plants or vines start dying back, like you see here. Now, because this is such a vigorous variety, what has happened is they started their usual dieback, I would say, about a month ago, and then it was like they caught a second wind and started, producing more green foliage. But when you see the plant start to catch a little disease, start to die back like this, this is a telltale sign you're getting ready to harvest. Now, not all of this whole patch right here is dyed back to this extent. If you look in the back there, you can see it looks pretty green and everything, but we're seeing enough dieback. We know the timing is pretty right as far as our date to maturity, that we know it's time to get in here and harvest. So these leaves at one point were, all this foliage was at least 4 or 5 foot tall. Everything's kind of died back. That's the number 1 sign that tells us we're ready to harvest. Now, our number 2 sign here has to do with the flesh on the fruits. And for this, we do what we call the fingernail scratch test. Now, I don't have a whole lot of fingernails, but what you do is just come along here and scratch them with your fingernail. And if none of this flesh comes off when you scratch them, it's nice and hard, it's not soft, it's not peeling off. When you scratch them, that's your second telltale sign they're ready to harvest. Our 3rd sign here has to do with the stem. So as these fruits mature on the vine, you'll see the stem go from green and it'll start fading in color and start getting really, really hard. And that's how you know they're ready to harvest. Now, when you're cutting these, you want to make sure you use some pruners and cut them a couple inches above the fruit, and that's going to make for better storage. You'll store longer that way. So that stem is nice and hard there. It's not flexible or anything. So that's our 3rd telltale sign these guys are ready to harvest. And then our 4th sign, as I mentioned earlier, is just simply knowing when you planted and what the maturity date of the squash is. So most winter squash are going to have a maturity date anywhere from 100 to 110 days. Some of them can go up to 120. I'd say 110 days is a good average. So we planted these middle of April, and here it is the end of July. So if we go from middle of April to May, June, July, now the end of July, we're you know, right at 100 days, 110 days or so. So we know from that these guys are ready to go. So I've got my pruning shears here, and we're about to start harvesting. We're gonna start filling up the back of my buggy here with these butternut squash. So I'm just gonna pick the ones immediately behind me, back the buggy up, fill it up some more. We'll probably end up with several buggy loads considering what I can see that we've got out here. But we'll see how many we get, and then we'll talk about storing these things and how to keep them so they'll last. I forgot to mention earlier, another way we can tell when these guys are ready to harvest is by the color of them. So winter squash will turn, the color will turn as they mature into what you know the final color to be. We know butternuts are supposed to be this kind of tan color right here. So they'll start off looking real green like this on the vine, and then as they mature, they'll lighten up and then become this kind of seasoned tan color here. Now, anytime you're harvesting winter squash, because these things are still blooming a little bit, you're gonna have some of these out there. Now, some people will say you can pick these and they'll turn in your storage area and they'll be fine. And I may pick, you know, the ones that look like this. Usually these green ones, honestly, I just kind of leave them out there. I've got plenty here, there's no shortage. So I'm not really harvesting these guys. If they're like this and they're almost, you know, turning tan, I might pick these, or like this guy right here, something like that. These real green ones, you can pick them. I usually just leave them out there. Another thing to mention here is some of the size and shape variation that we're seeing with this variety. So, like I told you before, this is an OP variety that was developed from two OP varieties, the Waltham Butternut and the Seminole Pumpkin. And because it's an OP variety, you're gonna see a decent amount of size and shape variation with the fruits. Now that's not a big deal, they'll all eat great, but you will see that. So for instance, let's look at this guy here compared to this guy here. So this guy has much less pronounced bulb. The shape is a little more uniform all the way down. This guy has the skinny neck and then the pronounced bulb at the bottom. This is just, you know, natural variation you're gonna see with OP varieties. Also with the size, you know, some of them are smaller, some of them are a lot bigger, even if they have kind of the same shape. Now, we do have a couple hybrid varieties we carry, one called Hoss and one called Polaris. And if you're really going for uniform shape and size, those are your probably better bets. With the OP variety, you're gonna get some variation, but you know, if you're just having these for yourself, or you know, even if you're selling them, if your customers are not demanding a certain shape and size, it's not a big deal. They're gonna eat good regardless of if they're stocky or kind of long and slender like this one. Now I made it about halfway through this plot right here, and this plot is about 25 feet wide by 65 foot long, and I've got a good buggy full right here. Like I said, a little over halfway through this plot, but I want to talk to you about a few mistakes we made in planting this particular variety in this plot here. So you can't tell where the rows were originally because it's just, you know, all vine out here. But what we did when we planted these is we put 4 rows in here, and we put them about 4 feet apart. And I put them close because I figured, hey, I got them on drip tape. I planted them on top of buried drip tape. put the transplants on top of the emitters, and I said, I got plenty of water to give these guys. I can stack them in here thick. Well, that worked well. I, didn't have any issue watering the guys, but I think the foliage density hampered my production a little bit. I did not realize that this South Anna butternut was going to sprawl so much and produce so much foliage. And I think I would have got a few more fruits per plant had I gave them a little more space. Now, along the row, I put transplants every 2 feet, and I think that still works good. What I should have done, and what I'll do in the future in a plot like this, especially a longer plot, is I'll just put one row in the middle there. These vines crawl out easy 20 feet or so. I had to kind of use my lawnmower to cut it on the side. So what I would do in the future is just put one row down the middle of the spot, give it at least 10, 12 feet on each side. Still put my transplants every 2 feet, but give it plenty of room to sprawl on each side, and I think you would get more fruits per plant. There wouldn't be so much kind of overcrowding of the foliage here. So lesson learned. We're still getting good harvest, but I think we would have got a better harvest if we would have gave the plants more room or a wider row spacing. The second mistake we made is with our acorn squash that we planted on the end here. I didn't know, as I said, that these South Anna butternut were going to just sprawl and climb everywhere, and they took over those acorn squash to the extent that I couldn't even see to get in there and harvest them. And I should have harvested them at least a few weeks ago, but I just couldn't get in there because this foliage was still so thick. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So down here we've got some acorn squash, and these should be harvested when they're green. They'll turn yellow in storage a little bit. And these may look okay, but I can feel them until they're kind of too soft. They're probably already rotten inside, and I've seen some along this row here. They're already burst and rotten. And so what happened was these things matured earlier than the others. The plants are obviously already died back. All this foliage you see here is from the South Anna butternut. But the butternut squash just took over these acorn squash. So I couldn't get in here and harvest them. I couldn't tell when the plants were dying, when they needed to be harvested. And this crop of acorns here is just going to be pretty much a complete loss. Not a huge deal because we still got plenty of butternuts. Lesson learned there, to not plant these so close to something that's going to sprawl so much and cover up those plants. And that's just gardening, folks. Even if you've been doing this a while, you're going to still make mistakes. There's always something to learn. That's the fun thing about gardening. Even when you think you've got it all figured out, you will get yourself humbled real quick. So we learned our lesson with these South Anna butternuts. It's a good lesson to learn because we know that these plants are really, really healthy, really, really vigorous. We just know that we need to give them plenty of room and not try to grow some other shorter maturing winter squash varieties right close to them. So we've got a buggy full here. I'm not going to harvest the rest of these right now. I'm going to go underneath the barn and I'm going to show you how we store our winter squash on our rack that we have underneath our pole barn. So this here is my storage rack underneath our pole barn. And before anyone asks, no, I do not have any design plans for this. I didn't draw up any plans or use any plans. Kind of just knew what I wanted, visualized it, and then made it in a way so I didn't waste any lumber. Everything is kind of, so I had, didn't have hardly any cuts when I made it. I'll give you the kind of basic dimensions here. So we're 6 foot tall here, 4x4s on each corner. We got 2x4s that wrap around here. I think this thing is about 4 foot wide. I think it's 8 foot long. You can build this however you want to for whatever space you need, for how many of your veggies you're needing to store. We use this thing for lots of different things. We use it for onions, we use it for Irish potatoes, we use it for garlic. We still got a little bit of garlic sitting on it back there. Sweet potatoes, winter squash, lots of different things that go into kind of a dry storage. So when you're building one of these, or when you're storing any of these types of vegetables, the main 3 things you want to focus on is you want to keep it dry, you want to have good airflow, keep it cool, and also a fourth thing, you need it to be shaded. So I built this one with several different racks here. I've got 4 racks on it. This top rack I use for mainly just storing supplies, buckets, harvesting containers, things like that. These other racks is where we put our vegetables. Now, as far as the racks go, I went with hardware cloth. I would highly recommend going with hardware cloth over chicken wire. Chicken wire will sag on you, especially if you're putting some of these real heavy butternut squash on them. So hardware cloth costs a little bit more, a decent amount more than chicken wire, but it's well worth the investment because it won't sag on you over time. I do have some 2x4s ran along the middle here to kind of support the hardware cloth. As far as the space between the racks, I went with, I think, 2 feet between the racks. Maybe it's 18 inches, I can't remember. Anyway, 18 inches, 2 feet, just enough to give myself room so I can reach in here. So however much room you need to reach in there, give yourself that much room. So that's what we did. We left a little space on the bottom there. You could put this closer to the bottom if you want to. I'm pretty tall, I don't like to bend down that far. So I got mine here about 18 inches off the bottom. So you can build one of these with just 1 rack, 2 racks, 3 or 4, just like I've got here. This thing's pretty heavy. I never move it. It stays in the same spot all the time, but it has been one of the best things I've ever built for my homestead. Extremely useful, great little winter project. This winter, if you don't have a lot of things going on in your garden, you know, take the time, build you a good storage rack to keep your potatoes, onions, garlic, sweet potatoes, and winter squash on. So we'll just take our butternut squash here. We don't want to stack them on top of one another. We just want to lay them up on this rack here and give them some room. Like I said, don't stack them right on top of one another. And we could use either one of these racks. It really wouldn't matter, just whichever one is available, whichever one is a little more handy. And these things will store for at least 6 months up here. Now, sometimes you'll hear people talking about curing winter squash. And what that means is just letting the sugars inside the fruit kind of mature a bit. And so these things will get a little more tasty as they sit here a few more weeks. You could eat them right now, but the sugars will mature and be a little more flavorful, I'd say, in a few weeks after they cure a little bit. So we'll at least probably fill up maybe this whole top rack here. We still got some out there to get. I will have to say, just in general, this South Anna butternut variety is definitely an A+ winner for me. I would highly recommend growing it. Just make sure you give it plenty of room to sprawl and do its things with the vines. I think you'll get better production per plant that way. And like I said, if you live in the South, you could grow these in the fall. If you live in the North, you know, plant them in late spring, and you should have a good little late summer, early fall harvest. I'll put a link below to our South Anna butternut squash. You can check those out and go grab some for yourself. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to give me a big thumbs up. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and hit that bell button down below so you get notified every time we come out with a new video. And if you did enjoy this one, check out these other 2 winter squash videos right here. I think you'll really enjoy those as well. We'll see you next time.